Hi, Richard Foster from Foster Infrastructure here. Today I'm going to give you a quick overview of the PPP framework here in Australia. PPP frameworks can be considered to consist of 5 key elements. Firstly, there's a set of implementing principles. Secondly, an operational framework, or what's sometimes called a process management framework. Thirdly, a fiscal management framework to manage the fiscal implications of PPPs. Fourthly, an institutional framework setting out the roles and responsibilities within government for the management of PPPs and their oversight. And finally, a group of other elements of the framework that are bundled together under the heading Other Governance-Related Matters. Let's take a look at the implementing principles for PPPs in Australia. The implementing principles are primarily documented in the National PPP Policy. However, most PPPs in Australia are undertaken at the sub-national level, in particular by the larger state governments. Australia is a federal country consisting of 6 states and 2 self-governing territories, and the largest states that undertake most of the PPPs have very significant economies and strong fiscal positions. For example, the state of Victoria, where I'm located, the second largest Australian state, it has an economy that is similar in size to the economies of countries like Colombia, Chile, or the Philippines, and larger than the economy of Greece. What's more, the larger states in Australia have AAA credit ratings, so they're in very sound fiscal positions. As it is actually the states that undertake most of the PPPs, the national PPP policy has to be applied by the individual state governments. How is this done? Well, what we have is what are called jurisdictional requirements for each state and territory that set out how the national PPP policy is applied in the individual state or territory. So here in Victoria, we have what are called the Partnerships Victoria requirements, and they set out how the national PPP policy will be implemented within the state of Victoria. The second element of the framework is the operational framework. In Australia, we have very substantial guidelines that sit alongside the national PPP policy. So a standardised set of national PPP guidelines, and these too are applied at the state and territory level under the jurisdictional requirements. In addition, though, we have very well developed broader infrastructure processes that are followed by government for both PPP and non-PPP projects. So here in the state of Victoria, we have what we call our investment lifecycle guidance, and that applies to all projects, PPP and non-PPP, together with the national PPP guidelines, and they provide us with our operational framework for the delivery of projects as PPPs. The next element of the framework is the fiscal management framework. Now, unlike many other countries, the way we do PPPs in Australia does not create large contingent liabilities that need to be managed under a separate regime, under a standalone PPP fiscal management regime. In fact, most of the liabilities created by our PPPs are direct liabilities in the form of government payments. We are not in the habit of giving guarantees that create significant contingent liabilities. In addition, we have what is perhaps the most conservative approach to accounting for PPPs of any country, Under this approach, government payments in respect of the capital cost of the asset are inevitably recognised on the government's balance sheet. We do not regard PPPs as a way of hiding projects off the government's balance sheet. Now, this accounting approach is part of our broader suite of government accounting policies. It's not a separate PPP policy, it is part of the general set of accounting standards that apply to government. And those accounting standards then influence the way we budget for and financially report in relation to our PPPs. And so in our budget process, PPPs are effectively competing for the available budget capacity alongside traditionally delivered projects on an equal footing. And then when we come to financial reporting in respect of our PPPs, we report them both in terms of their impact on the government balance sheet, and also, very importantly, we report in significant detail at the project level on the financial commitments we're making that are future liabilities of the government, but are not currently reflected on the government balance sheet. So I believe we have a very strong fiscal management regime for our PPP projects. The fourth element of the PPP framework is what we call the Institutional Framework. Here we follow a very similar approach to many other countries, and each state and territory has its own institutional arrangements, but they generally involve having a central agency of government with an oversight responsibility for the PPP policy, the jurisdictional requirements, and the overall program, while individual line agencies, line ministries, have responsibility for the individual projects. So here in the state of Victoria, individual ministers are ultimately accountable for the individual projects within their portfolios, and the projects are typically managed by their portfolio department or an agency within or sitting under that portfolio department. So transport PPPs are managed within the Department of Transport or by agencies within that department. But there's a central responsibility for the overall PPP program that sits with the Department of Treasury and Finance, and in particular with a team called the Partnerships Victoria team within the Department of Treasury and Finance. And they have an overall responsibility for the governance of the PPP program, for dealing with policy issues that affect PPPs across the board, and so on. And ultimately, it is our state treasurer who has the overall responsibility for the state's PPP policy and programs. In addition, an important part of our institutional framework is the governance arrangements that are put in place for each project, and typically this involves a steering committee or some similar body on which relevant agencies within government are represented to help provide guidance to the project team within the responsible ministry and to endorse any key decisions that need to be made during the life of the project. The fifth component of the PPP framework are other governance-related matters, and this, in the case of the state of Victoria, includes a number of elements. Firstly, we have very well developed quality assurance processes. In particular, we have what we call gateway reviews that are independent reviews at particular points in the life of a project, where an independent team comes in and reviews the project and provides advice on whether it's ready to proceed to the next phase and what might be done to better ensure the success of the project. Additional quality assurance reviews can also be mandated at particular stages of the project's life to look at particular aspects of the project and ensure that the project is being appropriately managed, that risks are being properly considered, and so on. Another important element of the framework is oversight by our Auditor General. Our Auditor General conducts performance reviews of PPP projects. During the current year, the Auditor General's review plan includes a review of the Ravenhall prison project, which is a project that I worked on, and in particular, that project involves the private sector building and operating a prison. That project has a particular focus on the rehabilitation of prisoners, so that once they leave prison, they become responsible members of society and they don't commit future crimes. The Auditor General is going to look into the processes that have been put in place under that contract and the government's monitoring of those rehabilitation activities to look at whether the contract is in fact driving the outcomes that were intended. Disclosure is also a very important part of our PPP framework. After each PPP contract is signed, the government releases a project summary that explains the history of the project to date, how the tender process was conducted, what the outcome of the tender process was, what the commercial deal is agreed with the private sector, and other key features. And that provides an accessible way for people to understand what it is that government has committed to over the course of the PPP contract. In addition, we also release on the internet the PPP contracts themselves. In some cases, some commercially sensitive information has to be removed before public disclosure, but the vast majority of the contract is there and available for anyone to read. In some projects, we also release the business case, which is the detailed assessment of the project that led to the government decision that the project should proceed, should go to tender, and should be developed as a PPP. A final aspect of the framework is communication, and there are extensive communication activities undertaken, particularly by that Partnerships Victoria team within the Department of Treasury and Finance, to ensure that there is a strong understanding of the state's approach to PPP projects and to the future project pipeline. So there's strong dialogue there with the private sector, such that the private sector understands what projects might be coming to tender in the future, and there's extensive information available on past projects and the outcomes of past projects. So that's a quick summary of PPP frameworks in Australia. It's really important to understand that in fact much of the framework sits at a state government level. Last year a report was issued by the Inter-American Development Bank that looked at a particular aspect of PPP frameworks in various countries, and in looking at Australia they only looked at the national level. They didn't consider the fact that in fact most of the PPP activity in Australia is at a state level. The private sector is well aware of that. The private sector interacts with the state governments. And by only looking at the national level, they actually missed key parts of the Australian approach to PPPs, which really undermines their assessment. I'll link below to the documents that I've referred to, so the National PPP Guidelines, the Partnerships Victoria requirements, some of the project summaries and so on, so you can go and see how all of those elements of the framework come together in practice. And don't forget to hit subscribe below so you find out about future videos from Foster Infrastructure.